Activity 3, page 182.
Is this loud enough?
High-tech harvesting. Hope or horror?
Take a look at these tomatoes. Pretty nice, huh? Both look good. Both look fresh. What if I told you that one of them contained genetic material from a fish? You heard me right, a fish. You'd look at me like I was crazy. Tempted? Well, welcome to the world of genetically engineered food. And I've given you a little title for this talk today. I called it High-Tech Harvesting, Hope or Horror, so it gives you an idea of what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about the science of genetic engineering of crops, what scientists have already done, what they're doing now, and then, as many of you know, the controversies that have arisen with this new technology. But first, let's just talk about farming in general. Farming as a human activity began roughly 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago. And as you know, agriculture changed everything. Instead of having to search constantly for food, humans could settle down, form communities, and then when you form communities, you can start trading. And then cities developed. Science, technology, the world we know today, farming was key. And our first farmers were basically organic farmers. Now we have the idea of going back to organic farming. But the first farmers didn't choose organic farming for philosophical reasons. They basically learned how to farm, finding out what were the natural ingredients that could kill or repel pests or harmful insects. What were the natural fertilizers that could improve their crop output and quality? Through trial and error, they figured out ways to keep their land growing year after year, a process called crop rotation. They learned to rotate crops. Why? Because they found that if they rotated crops, they probably didn't know the science of it, but they found that if they rotated crops year by year, that their land would stay healthy. And if they didn't rotate crops, eventually certain crops would start not doing well. Later on, we learn why. For example, corn uses up nitrogen. Soybeans, on the other hand, draw nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. So what a great combination. If you plant corn one year and you plant soybeans the next year and keep on going like that, you're taking away nitrogen, you're putting it back in the soil, and so your land remains fertile enough to keep growing corn every other year. But if you just tried to grow corn year after year, what would happen? You'd just be using up nitrogen. So farming originally was just organic. It was natural. But the last century of farming really changed that. Actually, not even the whole last century, just since the 1940s. And that's when we saw our increased use of chemicals. So it's since the 1940s that the use of chemicals for pesticides and fertilizers has exploded. At this point now, estimates are that farmers around the world use 3 million tons of pesticides each year. 3 million tons. And you know the drawbacks to chemical use. When we're trying to use chemicals to kill certain pests, insects, there are health risks to animals, humans, because it's indiscriminate and harms different species along with the target species. And also, we know that disruptions to the natural ecosystem can create problems affecting other animals and plants in the system. You kill one insect or animal, but then another species proliferates because its natural enemy has been eliminated. And another thing is that insects and other pests adapt, and often they develop greater and greater resistance to chemical pesticides. And that explains why our use of pesticides keeps growing and growing. So as the resistance grows, more pesticides are used, more toxic pesticides are used, and on and on and on. What about chemical fertilizers? fertilizers to make the soil healthier. Well, again, it has drawbacks. Chemical fertilizers change the soil ecology, and so repeatedly using these chemical fertilizers can make soil too acidic or too salty. And also what happens is that chemical fertilizers allow farmers to stop rotating crops, because really it's a bit of a pain to change crops every year. So that's more convenient in the short term, but in the long term, it causes the soil to get worse and worse. So over the decades, some have returned to organic farming methods. A great number of farmers are converting to organic cultivation, going back to older methods. But something radically new has happened in the history of farming in the past few decades, since the 1980s, and that's the advent of genetically engineered crops. The first genetically engineered plants grown outdoors, by the way, were in 1986. 1986. Before some of you were born, true, but not too long ago, really. 1986. So that's a key year. The first genetically engineered plants grown outdoors, 1986. Now, the basic idea of genetic modification in farming isn't new. I mean, farmers have modified crops for thousands of years through selective breeding and crossbreeding of different types. Just think of roses, for example. All the time, new roses are created in different colors with different growing characteristics. But bioengineering takes this concept much further. And when I use the word bioengineering, we're talking about genetic engineering. Here, we're manipulating the genes themselves. And there are 3 different ways that can be done. 3 different ways. One form of bioengineering involves making changes to existing genes, changing the existing genes within the plant. As an example, perhaps you want to grow roses without thorns, so you turn off the gene that controls the growth of thorns. And magic, roses without thorns. Now, another form of bioengineering involves moving genes from one organism into another organism of the same species. So imagine you've got a wild tomato that is stronger, hardier, more resistant to cold, grows better in poor soil, and you move a gene for hardiness from that wild tomato to the domesticated variety. The goal then is to make your better tasting domesticated variety take on some of the good characteristics of the wild variety. And lastly, you've got the form of bioengineering that becomes the most controversial, where you change the plants by adding genes from unrelated species. So the scientist takes one part of a gene from one species and inserts it into the DNA of another species. And these new plants are called, the word we use is transgenic. Let me write that. Transgenic. Trans meaning across genes. So the new plants contain genes from species with which normally they would never reproduce. Anyway, an example of a transgenic plant? At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that tomato that had genetic material from a fish in it. Now, that's a real story. This was in the 1990s. Scientists were trying to figure out how to make a tomato that would resist frost or cold better. And to do this, scientists transferred genetic material from a fish that lives in freezing temperatures. Now, this particular project eventually was abandoned, perhaps because the idea so turned off consumers, but it has been done. Now, all these steps of bioengineering and gene transfer are time-consuming, but once it's done, it's done. If it was successful, the process doesn't have to be repeated, because from that time on, the offspring, or seeds, will all have the new genetic information and can continue to pass it on. Now, I titled this little talk, High-Tech Harvesting, Hope or Horror, so let's take a look at the hopeful side first. and advocates of genetic engineering say that it can benefit humankind in so many different ways. So here's the positive side. The first argument: scientists think that they can create plants with stronger natural defenses against insects, pests, microbes, and so this could replace toxic pesticides, they say, and increase crop yields. And we're already doing that with cotton, for example, reducing the use of insecticides because of genetically engineered cotton that's more pest resistant. Advocates also say that genetic engineering could lead to more nutritious crops. They can add vitamins and minerals to key crops, and they are already doing that by adding vitamin A and folic acid to rice in some parts of the world. And advocates say this is a great thing because in some parts of the world where there's malnutrition, eating this rice can prevent birth defects, blindness, and really around the world now, there's a huge number of preschool children who suffer from vitamin A deficiency, between 125,000 and 250,000 preschool children. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could just give them those vitamins that they need in genetically engineered rice? Okay, another thing advocates say is that adding genes could equip plants to survive in places with poor soil. So that would require less irrigation, less water wastage, and there are corn crops, for example, that require less water. One more thing advocates say is that genetically engineered produce could last longer before rotting, and in many parts of the developing world, it takes a long time to get produce from the fields to the market because of poor transportation, poor roads. What a great boon for those communities. Fruits and vegetables that last longer before rotting. And finally, another thing. Adding medicines and pharmaceuticals to plants. Bananas, for example, could be genetically modified to deliver the hepatitis B vaccine. Right now, the cost of the vaccine is fairly expensive for many people in developing countries. But a banana that delivers the same vaccine would be less intimidating, of course, and it could cost a lot less, saving thousands of lives. A lot of good things, advocates say. But what's the other side of the story? What are the concerns about genetically engineered crops? Will they lead to long-term harm to human health? Opponents say that bioengineering changes plants by doing something nature never does, adding genes from other species of plants and even animals. So they say no one knows for sure what can happen in the long run. And they also say that it could increase allergy attacks because, let's say you're allergic to peanuts, and there are genetically engineered products that include genes from peanuts. But you didn't know that. You thought you were eating a carrot, for example. So could transgenic products increase allergic reactions when people don't realize what they're eating? That could be dangerous for a number of people. Another fear involves what would happen if the genetically modified crops escape. If wind or insects carry pollen from genetically engineered corn into a field of regular corn, will it breed and take over? And what happens if it does? So that raises big issues. How can farmers control the spreading of these genetically engineered crops? And then, if it spreads, who owns these new seeds and plants, since large corporations fund and direct most bioengineering research? In fact, there's a true story here. Something of this sort happened in Canada when genetically engineered seeds got into a farmer's crop by way of insects or wind. And the company that produced the seeds sued the farmer, claiming that he was violating their patent because he hadn't paid for the seeds. And the company won. And that brings us to the question of money. Opponents say that genetically engineered crops produce profits only for those large corporations that invent them, and the crops don't necessarily become